Hi guys, for this week for tactics, I wanted to look at something that has slowly dawned on me over the year or so that we've been playing Old World. When I played Warhammer initially, the game was based on principles that, for example, one of them that I remember viscerally was the idea that if you are charging, you get the benefit of the doubt. So that the game was an aggressive game, and that we wanted to see models fight each other or armies fight each other through models, and that if you were going to charge, that you deserved to have the benefit of the doubt in any sort of rule dispute. And even now, I think when you see some of the FAQ documents from Games Workshop where they put in their little sort of snarky or comments, they tend to be like, yeah, of course the attacker gets this benefit or something like that. And it just doesn't really ring true in the old world. I'm not, you've probably heard us comment on this channel a few times about the rules and how they might be improved, but in many ways they're contradictory. And in some ways, I feel like they don't really sort of even represent what they're trying to do on the battlefield. An area where I've come to believe this is the case is in the choice between charging or marching. So on top of that, in the past, marching was often more difficult to do. You had to stop within 8 inches of other units. Now, if you roll it past your marching or as far as you can, and you can triple march with some units, and you can also roll a leadership test and just march, even when you're right next to another unit. So this gives you incredible flexibility in how you move your troops. Charging is a little bit riskier. So when you charge, you're adding a base movement, and in the Swift Stride era, having Swift Stride means that you sort of have this level of redundancy and range that sort of outzones everybody else. But beneath that, even if you're rolling four, your movement is say 4 or 5, and you've got to take the high roll. Like you're generally going to roll four. The odds are actually pretty good on rolling a 5 or even a 6 from 2 dice, especially if you have a reroll for something like Warband. But in this instance, the having a failed charge is one of the worst things that can happen in Warhammer. And on top of that, where you can really start to manipulate or improve the chances of your opponent getting a failed charge are when they have to go through difficult or dangerous terrain. So Paddy and I I think Paddy made the video earlier with a Shaggoth in a game against Wood Elves. Paddy wasn't my opponent in these images, but where the Shaggoth had tried to make a charge through difficult terrain, had rolled a 1 and could and had to take that as the low roll in adding it to its movement for its charge move, and then only moves the 1 inch forward for the charge roll. So just a devastating result. Since then, I've been looking at ways to sort of get around this because I think I've been playing a combat army in Beastman more often. And yeah, charging is dangerous. On top of that, it's dangerous for another reason. So if you are going to charge and you lose that combat and give ground, even if you give ground, so unless you tie, but if you have to roll that leadership test, at best you are giving ground. You might be falling back in good order, you could be fleeing. So you've got to win that combat. Otherwise, your opponent is going to get a decision. If they pass the leadership test, they're going to be able to restrain and reform. So you go in, you lose combat, uh, even giving ground, they roll their leadership test, and they can do things like pivot or they can reform essentially. And by reforming, they now face any direction they like, and they can then charge away on their turn. And given the negative things I've said about charging, you might say, was that great? Well, you can always march away out of trouble as well. But the battle lines tend to be more condensed at this point. You're giving your opponent a lot more options. So not only do you need to make the charge, you need to make sure you win combat, and then you've got to survive another turn before the restrain and reform comes back into your favor. So this is a really critical sequence if you're trying to improve your play, that charging is not always advantageous. Combat results gear towards a lot of restraining and reforming, and restraining and reforming is one of the most powerful things in the game because a lot being square based, you're meant to be restricted by your front arc. Suddenly, you can flip 270 degrees and run off in another direction and leave whoever you're in combat with in the dust. And that's what happens in these examples. So I just want to point out how I didn't, even though I was improving and made some progress here, I didn't do as well as my opponent did. Mark, congratulations, because I'll point out a little thing he did that made me believe not only that I'm right on this thing, but there was still other ways I could do this even better. So in the image on the left, the Shaggoth has marched all the way up into the forest. By touching the forest, I have a line of sight through the forest. But most of those, if I want to charge that unit of Deepwood Scouts or pretty much anything next turn, I'm going to have to take the low roll on that dice, which is going to be prohibitive. That looks like at least 6 inches across. I'm not even going to make out of the forest. I'm going to be taking the low roll again. If you've ever played Wood Elves, by that stage, no one else is going to be around. On the right side image, I have the option of charging with my Razor Gore or my Dragon Ogres. And in this instance, what you can see, I suppose, the Shaggoth could go after them as well. So you might say, oh, maybe they could reach. But they could flee there, and that's going to cause problems as well. So the issue here is, should I charge? What should I charge with that Razor Gore? And I spent probably the most amount of time on this than anything in the game, and I definitely made the wrong decision. So what ends up happening here is the Razor Gore has charged those streak in the intervening period. You can see on that top right image, there was a pillar of fire placed right next to my Dragon Ogres. So if I wanted to charge the Dragon Ogres and the Razor Gore into the Treekin, my Dragon Ogres would have had to go through the pillar, which meant they would have had to take the low roll. And that would have risked a failed charge. If I'd failed that charge, his units could have got away from me next turn, and I really needed to start to get into combat. So I chose to throw away this Razor Gore into the combat with the Treekin on the left. What ends up happening there so that gives it then a clear path for my Dragon Ogres to hit the other unit of Treekin, which is the combat I'm hoping to win. And the Razor Gore, I believe, is going to lose combat in the front. I thought I'd been really clever, and instead of charging with the Shaggoth, I had marched right up. So the trick is to march within the wheel arc of the tree of the unit because you can't wheel backwards, so they're not going to be able to get away because all of the other maneuvers are going to involve such a stiff penalty on their movement that they'll remain in the Shaggoth's charge arc. So what happens here is that I think, well, what will ensue is the Treekin will probably kill the Razor Gore. The Razor Gore will either flee or die. And even if they don't overrun, they're stuck. How wrong was I? So I feel like I was really clever, but what I should have done, well, I'll say first, what Mark did. Mark wins the combat. The Razor Gore dies to the Treekin. And because, as I just explained before and didn't take my own advice, he then tested to reform and he passed. And he reformed in a way that angled that unit. So it had to reform around the center model. The model on the right is going to move through the Shaggoth, which is allowed by the rules, as long as it doesn't finish in base contact or it's got to finish 1 inch away from the Shaggoth. That's what it just has to finish not in base contact with the Shaggoth, and then it will get nudged an inch. But then so they were then facing the other way. So they've pivoted right through, and next turn they charge my other unit of Dragon Ogres. So my Shaggoth is left with well, everyone else is cleared out at that stage. He did get to charge those archers, but that's another story. Like out of all of the targets there, that wasn't the one I was after. So really, the play for me, even though I told you all about this and I've been planning on doing it beforehand. And I was patting myself on the back for the Shaggoth maneuver, thinking, here I am next turn with 4 possible targets. I should have marched with that Razor Gore, hopefully outside 8 inches, or even just moved it to as close as possible into the wheel arc of the Treekin. Instead of charging, which what I did was give my opponent that flexibility next turn to do whatever he wanted. It's highly technical. I don't think it's the way Warhammer should be played. I think give ground and fall back in good order seem nice in theory. I think it's starting to feel very gamey the way people manipulate them. I think charging should be advantageous. I think winning combats should be advantageous. But I feel like a lot of the tricks in this game are about preserving units and points denial. I don't want to get started on pursuit and peril tests, but I think if you are looking to play well, this is one of the biggest levers I've been able to pull, especially if you're a combat army, that when we look into hammer, anvil, and chaff units, the foundation of being an anvil unit is you can take that charge. And if you can just survive for one turn, you're going to get the choice on whether to follow up, pursue, etc., with the knowledge that you have the close range charges coming next turn that are going to decide the game. So I hope you found this interesting. Let me know in the comments what you think. We'll be back next week with more content. See you later.